In this lecture, you are going to learn about Berlin Wall, the Peace Corps, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Apollo program. In June of 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev held a meeting in which the Soviet premier demanded an agreement recognizing the existence of two Germanys. The massive exodus of East Germans into West Berlin embarrassed the communists, and to stop this flow of escapees from behind the Iron Curtain, East Germany erected a wall between East and West Berlin, shocking the world. That night, Premier Khrushchev gave the East German government permission to stop the flow of immigrants by closing its border for good. In just 2 weeks, the East German army, police force, and volunteer construction workers had completed a makeshift barbed wire and concrete block wall, the Berlin Wall, that divided one side of the city from the other. Before the wall was built, Berliners on both sides of the city would move around fairly freely. They crossed the east-west border to work, to shop, to go to the theater and the movies. Trains and subway lines carried passengers back and forth. After the wall was built, it became impossible to get from East to West Berlin, except through one of the 3 checkpoints. The Berlin Wall stood until November 9, 1989, when the head of the East German Communist Party announced that citizens of the GDR could cross the border whenever they please. That night, ecstatic crowds swarmed the wall. Some crossed freely into West Berlin, while others brought hammers and picks and began to chip away at the wall itself. To this day, the Berlin Wall remains one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of the Cold War. In all, 171 people were killed trying to get over, under, or around the Berlin Wall. Escape from East Germany was not possible. However, from 1961 until the wall came down in 1989, more than 5,000 East Germans, including some 600 border guards, managed to cross the border by jumping out of windows adjacent to the wall, climbing over the barbed wire, flying in hot air balloons, crawling through the sewers, and driving through unfortified parts of the wall at high speeds. After the erection of the Berlin Wall, the Kennedy administration hardened its policy towards the Soviet Union and increased military spending. The Kennedy administration also tried to complement his anti-Soviet policy with fresh approaches to the nationalist movements for independence that had convulsed the world since the end of World War II. More than his predecessors, Kennedy publicly supported Third World democratic and nationalist aspirations. In 1961, Kennedy launched his most dramatic Third World initiative, the Peace Corps. Kennedy also used direct military means, usually in the form of elite special forces, to bring political stability to the Third World. One of Kennedy's most challenging foreign policy crises, however, came from Cuba, an island nation miles away from U.S. soil. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro and his Revolutionary Army initiated a new era of Cuban history. Having ousted the corrupt Cuban president, Fulgencio Batista, who had fled Havana on New Year's Eve, Castro and his rebel forces made their way through the capital city's streets. The United States, which had long supported Batista's corrupt regime, initially expressed sympathy for Castro's new government, which was immediately granted diplomatic recognition. But President Dwight Eisenhower and members of his administration were weary. The new Cuban government soon instituted leftist economic policies centered on agrarian reform, land redistribution, and the nationalization of private enterprises. Cubans, wealthy and middle-class citizens, fled the island in droves. Many settled in Miami, Florida, and other American cities. The relationship between Cuba and the United States deteriorated rapidly. On October 19, 1960, the United States instituted a near-total trade embargo to economically isolate the Cuban regime, and in January 1961, the two nations broke off formal diplomatic relations. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, acting under the mistaken belief that the Castro government lacked popular support and that Cuban citizens would revolt if given the opportunity, began to recruit members of the exile community to participate in an invasion of the island. On April 16, 1961, an invasion force consisting primarily of Cuban emigres landed on Huron Beach at the Bay of Pigs. Cuban soldiers and civilians quickly overwhelmed the exiles, many of whom were taken prisoner. The Cuban government's success at stopping the Bay of Pigs invasion did much to legitimize the new regime and was a tremendous embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. As the political relationship between Cuba and the United States disintegrated, the Castro government became more closely aligned with the Soviet Union. This straining of ties set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the most dramatic foreign policy crisis in the history of the United States. In 1962, in response to the United States' long-time maintenance of a nuclear arsenal in Turkey, and at the invitation of the Cuban government, the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. On October 14, 1962, American spy planes detected the construction of missile launch sites, and on October 22, President Kennedy addressed the American people to alert them of this threat. Over the course of the next several days, the world watched in horror as the United States and the Soviet Union hover on the brink of nuclear war. Finally, on October 28, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. agreement to remove its missiles from Turkey and a formal pledge that the United States will not invade Cuba, and the crisis was resolved peacefully. While the Cuban Missile Crisis contributed to Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later, Kennedy emerged triumphant. As a result, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed a limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. While the Cuban Missile Crisis put humanity on the brink of extinction, the space program will take humanity where it had never gone before. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced before a special joint session of Congress the dramatic and ambitious goal of sending a man safely to the moon before the end of the decade. A number of political factors affected Kennedy's decision and the timing of it. In general, Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States catch up to and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. 4 years after the Sputnik shock of 1957, the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space on April 12, 1961, greatly embarrassing the U.S. While Alan Shepard became the first American in space on May 5th, he only flew on a short flight instead of orbiting the Earth, as Gagarin had done. In addition, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in mid-April put an unquantifiable pressure on Kennedy. He wanted to announce a program that the U.S. had a strong chance of achieving before the Soviet Union. After consulting with Vice President Johnson, NASA Administrator James Webb, and other officials, he concluded that landing an American on the moon would be a very challenging technological feat, but an area of space exploration in which the U.S. actually had a potential lead. Thus, the Cold War is the primary contextual lens through which many historians now view Kennedy's speech. The decision involved much consideration before making it public, as well as an enormous human effort and expenditures to make what became Project Apollo a reality by 1969. Only the construction of the Panama Canal in modern peacetime and the Manhattan Project in war were comparable in scope. NASA's overall human spaceflight efforts were guided by Kennedy's speech. Project Mercury, at least in its later stages, Gemini, and Apollo were designed to execute Kennedy's goal. Nearly 2 years after his famous speech, President Kennedy will be assassinated on November 22, 1963. But this will not stop the goal of getting to the moon. the mission continued. Then on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 became the first manned mission to land on the moon. The landing fulfilled President Kennedy's mission of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, while Michael Collins orbited above. Armstrong's famous words remind us that the event was one of the defining moments of the 20th century. When the lunar module landed, he said, "Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed." As he stepped onto the moon's surface for the first time, he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.